So thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you. I thought I'd start out with a story. In 1944, in Abbeville, Alabama, an African-American woman named Reese Taylor walked home from a church revival. A car full of white men kidnapped her off the street, drove her to the woods, and gang raped her at gunpoint. Then they dropped her off in the middle of town, and they told her if she ever told anybody what happened, they would kill her. It was a pretty credible threat in Alabama in 1944. But that night, she found the courage to tell her husband, her father, and the local sheriff the details of this brutal assault. And a few days later, the Montgomery NAACP called to say they were sending their very best investigator. Her name was Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks carried Taylor's story back to Montgomery, where she and the city's most militant activists organized the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Reese Taylor. And they launched a national protest movement that the Chicago Defender, the largest black newspaper in the nation, called, quote, the strongest campaign for equal justice to be seen in a decade. They compared it really only in its scope to the Scottsboro campaign of the 1930s. 11 years later, this homegrown group of activists would become better known as the Montgomery Improvement Association, vaunting its very first president, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to international prominence, and launching their own movement, the bus boycott, that would help to change the world. But when this coalition to defend Reese Taylor first took root, Dr. King was just in high school. And so the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, which is often heralded as the opening scene of the civil rights drama, is, I think, in many ways, one of the last acts of a decades-long struggle to protect black women like Reese Taylor from sexualized violence and rape. Now, the kidnapping and rape of black women, particularly Reese Taylor and others, was not really that unusual in the segregated South. In fact, from slavery through the better part of the 20th century, white men abducted and assaulted black women with alarming regularity and often with stunning impunity. They lured black women and girls away from home with the promises of work and better wages. They attacked them on the job. They abducted them at gunpoint while traveling to or from home or work or school or church. And they sexually humiliated and assaulted them in public places, particularly on buses and streetcars and other public areas. And this was the pattern throughout the South during the Jim Crow era, and it really underscored the limits of Southern justice. But this is the thing. Black women did not always keep their voices silent. They did not always keep these stories secret. In fact, from the slave narratives of Harriet Jacobs to Ida B. Wells to Fannie Lou Hamer's stark testimony about a forced hysterectomy and a sexualized beating in 1963, black women reclaimed their humanity by organizing public protests and testifying about these assaults. And it was these testimonies that would lead to larger campaigns for civil and human rights. In fact, even the most oft-told and illustrious tales of civil rights campaigns like the Montgomery bus boycott, the Selma campaign, or the 1964 Freedom Summer, they frequently have an unexamined history of gendered political appeals to protect black women from sexual violence. And so what I did in my research was I argued that essentially sex and sexual violence sit at the center of the modern civil rights movement. So let's talk about that a little bit. In popular memory, most people start the bus boycott with the Brown decision, and then they go, the history of the civil rights movement with the Brown decision, and then they go right into the bus boycott. And so you know something about that, I suppose, right? Who started the bus boycott, according to popular history? Rosa Parks. And what was it about Rosa Parks that made her not want to get out of her seat that day? Her feet were tired. They were really tired. Are we really expected to believe that Rosa Parks' foot fatigue brought down the cradle of the Confederacy? It's a very interesting story, isn't it? A simple story, a lasting story. Well, when asked the same question, what caused the bus boycott, Joe Belle, the city editor of the Montgomery Advertiser, sort of the white newspaper in Montgomery, he talked about somebody totally different. He talked about a woman named Gertrude Perkins, and this is what he said.
Gertrude Perkins is not even mentioned in the history books, but she had as much to do with the bus boycott and its creation as anyone on earth.
Now, Gertrude Perkins loomed large enough in Joe Belle's memory for him to recall her name in an interview that he gave 40 years after the bus boycott. And I heard him talk about Gertrude Perkins on the radio in, I think it was 1998. Yet most histories of the bus boycott rarely even mention her name. And if your response is anything like mine was when I first heard this, you might be thinking, well, who the heck is Gertrude Perkins? Well, Gertrude Perkins, it turns out, was a 25-year-old African-American woman who was abducted and raped by 2 white Montgomery police officers on March 27, 1949. I'll let Reverend Solomon Say Sr., one of the more outspoken ministers in Montgomery at the time, explain exactly what happened that night.
2 policemen had picked her up and taken her down on the railroad and had all types of sex relations with her at that particular time. And when they put her out, she came to my door and she told me what had happened to her. I sat down and wrote what she said had happened to her, word by word. And when she had finished, I had it notarized and sent it to Deull in Washington. And Deull went to the air with it. And when the power structure knew anything here in Montgomery, what Gertrude Perkins said happened to her was all over the nation.
So after Gertrude Perkins told Reverend Say what happened, he then, took her testimony and sent it off to a syndicated columnist. And then they went to the police station, and they reported the crime to the police, perhaps even the same men who had attacked her. Of course, they denied it. The mayor claimed that her case was completely false, and he refused to hold a lineup of any of the police officers on duty that night. And of course, he refused to issue any warrants. Besides, he said, my policeman wouldn't do a thing like that. But African Americans in Montgomery knew better. They knew that Montgomery's police force had a history not just of racist brutality, but also of sexist brutality. In 1946, for example, police officers abducted and raped the 16-year-old daughter of a black woman who challenged a police officer on a segregated bus. E.D. Nixon, Reverend Solomon Say Sr., and other black activists tried to protest this attack and to try to keep it in the public eye. For example, Reverend Vernon Johns, who was the minister at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church before Dr. King got there, he wrote on the church marquee, "What happens when the rapist is white?" So when Gertrude Perkins was attacked 3 years later, in 1949, black leaders weren't about to let the police get away with another assault, and so they mobilized. NAACP activists, labor leaders, and ministers all formed an umbrella organization called the Citizens Committee for Gertrude Perkins, and they demanded an investigation and a trial. Their public protests lasted for over 2 months. And in the process, they were able to expose the long-standing practice of white police officers sexually assaulting black women. They forced a grand jury hearing, and they brought the city's disparate black ministers together really for the first time in a kind of coalition. This was really important. 2 years later, black activists in Montgomery rallied to defend another victim of sexual violence. In February of 1951, a white grocery store owner named Sam Green raped a black teenager named Flossie Hardman. Sam Green employed Flossie as his babysitter, and I found stories of babysitters all over the place. I mean, this was very common. Instead of driving her home one night, he drove her outside of town and assaulted her. Flossie Hardman told her parents about what happened, and they decided to press charges. But when an all-white jury returned a not guilty verdict after deliberating for a full 5 minutes, the family reached out to community activists. And so once again, a coalition formed. Members of the NAACP, of the newly formed Women's Political Council, community activists like Edie Nixon and Rufus Lewis, the same folks who had fought for Recy Taylor and for Gertrude Perkins, launched a boycott of Sam Green's grocery store. They thought, well, since most of his customers are African American, why don't we just stop patronizing the store and see what happens? And after only a few weeks of this boycott, African Americans in Montgomery delivered their own guilty verdict by driving Sam Green into the red. They shut the store down. The ability to shut down Sam Green's grocery store constituted a kind of major victory. For one thing, it established the boycott as a really powerful weapon for justice in a way that the courts weren't willing to do. A couple years later, Joanne Robinson, the leader of the Militant Women's Political Council, threatened a mass boycott of the city's buses after scores of black women complained about sexual harassment and racial violence on the buses. Because really, besides police officers, few were as guilty of these crimes against black passengers than were the city's bus operators, who bullied and brutalized black people daily. Worse, bus drivers had police power. They carried blackjacks and guns and assaulted and sometimes even killed African Americans who refused to abide by the racial order of Jim Crow. In 1953 alone, African Americans filed over 30 complaints of abuse and mistreatment on the buses, and most of these complaints came from working class black women, mostly domestics, the help, who needed to take the bus from the black side of town to the white side of town every single day in order to work in white women's kitchens. They made up the bulk of the Montgomery City Line's ridership. And they had a lot to say about the buses. They complained that bus drivers hurled nasty sexualized insults at them, that bus drivers touched them inappropriately and physically abused them. One woman remembered bus drivers sexually harassing her as she waited on the corner. The bus was up high, she said, and the street was down low. They'd drive up and expose themselves while I was just standing there. It scared me to death, she said. Another remembered that bus drivers treated black women, quote, just as rough as can be, like we're some kind of animals. Another woman said bus drivers like to talk under folks' clothes. Women walked, Rosa Parks said in 1956, not in support of her, but because she said, I was not the only person who had been mistreated and humiliated. Other women, she said, had gone through similarly shameful experiences, most worse than mine. It was these experiences that propelled African American women into every conceivable aspect of the bus boycott. And so it was black women who were the chief strategists and negotiators of the boycott, and they ran its day-to-day operation. They helped staff the elaborate carpool system that kept the boycott working. They raised most of the local money for the movement. They filled the majority of the pews at the weekly mass meetings where they would testify publicly about the abuses that they suffered. And of course, because they made up the majority of the riders, they walked. By walking hundreds of miles to protest humiliation, African American women reclaimed their bodies and demanded the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And so, while the bus boycott is often portrayed as a kind of spontaneous movement, Rosa Parks' feet were tired, so she just decided to have a boycott, or a primarily male-led movement, led, of course, by ministers like Dr. King, the truth is that the Montgomery bus boycott had a past. It had its own history. And that history is rooted in the struggle to protect and defend Black womanhood from racial and sexual violence. And I think it's impossible for us to situate and understand the boycott in its proper historical context without actually knowing and understanding the stories of Recy Taylor and Gertrude Perkins and Flossie Hardman and all of the other women who were mistreated in Montgomery. In fact, without this history, it's impossible to understand why thousands of Black women, working class and middle class, put their bodies on the line to protest the buses. Now, Montgomery wasn't the only place where attacks on Black women fueled protests against white supremacy. Civil rights campaigns in Little Rock, Arkansas, where Daisy Bates, the heroine of the Little Rock school desegregation movement, argued that the rape and murder of her mother fueled her interest in justice. In fact, throughout the 1940s and the early 1950s, Daisy Bates had a newspaper, and she used her newspaper to expose and to publicly shame white men who assaulted Black women, and then used those stories to launch campaigns to bring those men to justice. Or Albany, Georgia in 1962, where local people organized to defend Black women who attended Albany State College from white men who frequently broke into their dorms at night and prowled around campus looking for girls to assault. Those students would go on to help lead the Albany movement of 1962. Or the Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964, where Black women who were arrested for doing voter registration work were often beaten and sexually violated when they went to prison. All of these major campaigns have roots in organized resistance to sexualized violence and demands for the protection of Black womanhood, and yet, analyses of rape play little or no role in most histories of the African American freedom struggle, even as stories of violence against Black and white men, like Emmett Till or Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, provide really gripping analyses of racist brutality. So I think in order to understand the civil rights movement, we need to understand and know Black women's stories, and we need to know their history. And this history goes way back, because the sexual exploitation of Black women had its roots, of course, in slavery. Slave owners' stolen access to Black women's bodies strengthened their political, their social, and their economic power for two very simple reasons. One is that colonial laws made the offspring of slave women the property of their masters, giving white men, slave owners, a financial incentive to sexually exploit their slaves. And two, colonial laws that banned interracial marriage, but not fornication or childbirth out of wedlock, which awarded white men exclusive sexual access to white women while denying Black women the respectability and rights garnered by a legal relationship, especially, of course, inheritance rights. These laws created a system that allowed white men to police white women's sexual and marital choices and sexually abuse Black women with impunity, both of which maintained their position atop the racial and sexual hierarchy. And even after slavery fell, some of these laws and practices remained. For example, during Reconstruction, former slaveholders and their sympathizers used violence to reassert power and control over freed people, and rape becomes a weapon of terror, and interracial rape becomes the battleground upon which Black men and Black women fight for ownership and control of their own bodies. And so while Black women were, I think, the primary victims of interracial rape at this time, the idea of interracial rape was deployed by whites as a justification for lynching black men. In order to maintain power, whites created this myth, this idea of the black beast rapist, portraying black men at every turn as the mythological incubus, this creature that swoops down on white women when they're most vulnerable, when they're asleep. And they use this myth of the black beast rapist whenever they fear losing political power. For example, white Democrats in North Carolina played on the fear of the incubus in 1900 to regain political control after a biracial fusion party took every single statewide political office in 1896. And this political tactic continued throughout the 20th century. In the 1940s, African Americans joked that the closer a black man got to the ballot box, the more whites thought he looked like a rapist or some kind of demon. And we see this being used as a political tactic, especially after the Supreme Court issues the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, which outlaws segregation in public schools, because for most segregationists, integration only meant miscegenation. Or, as Mississippi judge and founder of the White Citizens Council, Tom Brady, put it, amalgamation. America has its choice. Headlines in the Citizens Council newspapers, and you know, the Citizens Council was kind of like an uptown Ku Klux Klan, right? In their newspapers, they warned whites in 1954 and 55 that the incubus was coming. Headlines screamed mixed marriage, sex orgies, and there were all kinds of accounts of black men raping white girls, which the Citizens Council newspaper said were, quote, typical of stories filtering back from areas where racial integration is proceeding with all deliberate speed. Here's a Citizens Council leader actually espousing these theories.
Don't you ever give up that gun. That's all you got left to protect that little baby in that crib. Because these dirty devils will be in your home. That's what they want. They do not want equality. You know they don't want equality. They don't want something like you got. They want what you got, your women.
Because segregationists employed these kinds of sexual scare tactics to oppose Brown and to cultivate white fear and resentment toward integration, any kind of racial or gender impropriety on the part of African Americans could be viewed as threatening the social order. That's why I think African Americans in Montgomery chose the more respectable Rosa Parks as a symbol of the movement instead of the many other women who could have very easily filled that role. There were other women who were arrested on the buses, of course. And it's why I think many in the movement downplayed Rosa Parks' militancy, particularly her long history of protesting racialized sexual violence. But I also think it's our fault, historians. Historians focus on respectability, historians focus on dissemblance, ignored what black women had been testifying about. As a result, I think we've missed some really important milestones in the civil rights movement. For example, the arrest, trial, and conviction of 4 white men for raping Betty Jean Owens, a black college student, in Tallahassee, Florida in 1959 was a watershed event. Owens' testimony focused national attention, even international attention, on the sexual exploitation of black women. And when an all-white jury handed down a life sentence for her assailants, it not only broke with Southern tradition, but it fractured the philosophical and political foundations of white supremacy by challenging the legal relationships between sexual domination and racial inequality. And so for perhaps the first time since Reconstruction, Southern blacks could actually imagine state power being used and deployed in defense of their manhood and womanhood. Betty Jean Owens' grandmother recognized the historic and political significance of the verdict. She said, "I've lived to see the day where white men would really be brought to trial for what they did." The Tallahassee case in 1959 led to other convictions that summer. In Montgomery, Alabama, in Raleigh, North Carolina, and even in Burton, South Carolina, where a Marine received the death penalty for raping a black woman. Now, this was pretty much unheard of. Rape was a capital crime in most of the South, but never, not once, had there been a white man sentenced to die for raping a black woman. And in this case, of course, it was overturned on appeal. Having said that, though, it's important that we recognize that in each of these cases, in Tallahassee, in Montgomery, in Raleigh, in South Carolina, white supremacy faltered in the face of these courageous black women who testified on their own behalf. John McCrae, who is the editor of the South Carolina Lighthouse and Informer, a black newspaper in South Carolina, wondered if these convictions pointed to a new day. He said, quote, "This forced intimacy goes back to the days of slavery, when our women were the chattel property of white men. Are we now witnessing the arrival of our women?" he asked. "Are they at long last gaining the emancipation they've needed?" John McCrae recognized that freedom was meaningless without ownership and control of one's body. Desegregation and equality meant very little if you could not actually walk down the street unmolested. As Ella Baker put it in 1960 after the sit-ins, the freedom struggle was about more than access to public accommodations. It was, she said, so much bigger than a hamburger. Another case in 1965 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, was a similar milestone that I think historians have missed. Now, in the months before SNCC sent black and white volunteers streaming into Mississippi for the '64 Freedom Summer, segregationists there armed themselves, quite literally, armed themselves for what they saw and what they called a sexual invasion. They prepared to meet what they called the Army of Amalgamation with violence if necessary. And in this photo, you can see the mayor of Jackson with his police force and their brand new tank. But I think if they were really worried about illicit integration, they should have focused their wrath on the white men in town who had been attacking black women with virtual impunity for a long, long time. Here's a clip of Endisha Ida Mae Holland, who testifies about black women and girls' special vulnerability in the Magnolia State.
I went to babysit for this white family, and the white woman called me upstairs. I went on upstairs in a hurry so as not to keep the white woman waiting. She said, "Mr. Lawrence wants to see you." And I looked in the bed. Mr. Lawrence was laying there among the bedclothes. They were so silky. And I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Lawrence, what you want with me?" And he immediately pulled me down into the bed and had intercourse with me. I was 11 years old that day. It was my birthday. There was no reason for us to run and tell our mother or our father because they couldn't do anything about it, but get killed if they said something about it. So many times, we girls would talk in the bathroom about it. You know, never telling our parents, but it happened very, very frequent.
The tenuousness of black life in Mississippi left more than physical scars. It also left deep psychological wounds, and not just on the victims and survivors of sexual violence.
I hated it. I had all kind of fantasies about it. I was fascinated by people like David and Goliath stories. These are my favorite biblical characters, the cats who kicked folks' butt. You know, I like Moses drowning everybody in the Red Sea. I used to go in the woods. I used to go in the backwoods and preach and scream, fight them, run into bushes, hit trees, and pretend they was white folks.
So you learn how to negotiate your life with white folks. And I guess you also learn the fear associated with them of how much power they actually held over you, how they could determine whether you continue to live or whether you die.
I think what's always surprised me is that in the face of this inhumanity, there were people who were willing to stand up and talk about what happened. And there were people who were willing to report these crimes. And there were people who refused to remain silent. And so after refusing to remain silent for more than 2 decades, I think, you've got all this history of black women's testimony in Mississippi and efforts, community efforts to protect them from sexual violence. And finally, in 1965, all of that work paid off when a white jury, an all-white jury, finally sentenced Norman Cannon, a 19-year-old white man, to life in prison for raping a black teenager in 1965. This was the first time that I found in Mississippi where a white man actually received life in prison for a crime that black men were often killed for. And an interesting side note in this case is that Norman Cannon appealed for relief in 2000 and was denied. And so Norman Cannon is one of those few people that I found in my research who actually served out his sentence. Most of the time, the men that I evaluated were released after a few months or were given a suspended sentence, something like that. Anyway, this is a big case in 1965. Major newspapers around the country hailed this unprecedented conviction as a sign that even Mississippi, the most unreconstructed state in the South, was finally making, or trying to appear to make, some serious changes. Now, like the Montgomery movement, the Selma campaign in 1965 has a kind of important history of sex and sexualized violence that historians have not fully explored. As you know, the 1964 Civil Rights Act left segregationists reeling. In Selma, Alabama, the staunchest supporters of segregation and white supremacy started to use the fear of interracial sex to resuscitate and to revive what they considered an ailing Jim Crow. And they used a kind of sexual McCarthyism to discredit the Voting Rights Act and to defame demonstrators who risked their lives on the Selma to Montgomery March. For example, white police officer and other authority figures, including William Dickinson, a state congressman, said that they saw SNCC leaders engaging in public sex, that volunteers camping overnight on the Selma to Montgomery March were involved in mass orgies, and that during the march, they said, black men were constantly exposing themselves and fondling white women. And their testimonies were available for everybody to read in this very lurid and voyeuristic magazine that became a kind of bestseller in 1965 called Sex and Civil Rights, The True Selma Story. And so civil rights activists were no longer just outside agitators or communists. Now they were sexual fiends, intent on spreading a culture of depravity around the country. It was within this storm, and because of it, really, that the Ku Klux Klan murdered Viola Liuzzo, a white housewife from Detroit who defied gender and racial mores by embracing the black freedom struggle. In fact, I think today is the day that she was murdered in Alabama. Her detractors, of course, accused her of not just embracing the black freedom struggle, but specifically of embracing black men. If we start looking at analyses of sex and sexual violence and we incorporate them into well-known civil rights narratives, we're going to change some of the historical markers of the civil rights movement. And so while in traditional circles, the Voting Rights Act is seen as the end of sort of the, I guess, the modern civil rights movement or the traditional short civil rights movement, I think one of the last legal barriers to black women's bodily integrity fell in 1967, when the Supreme Court overturned slave-era laws prohibiting interracial marriage in the landmark Loving versus Virginia case. In fact, the ban on interracial marriage was really one of the last vestiges of slavery to fall. But only by placing the Loving decision within this long struggle for black women's bodily integrity and freedom from both racial and sexual terror can it be properly recognized as a major marker in the modern civil rights movement. And one of the things I always wondered about when I was doing research for my book was whether or not black women had the right to defend themselves with violence if necessary from sexual attacks. And that question in some ways was answered by the 1975 trial of Joanne Little. Now, Joanne Little was a petite, 20-year-old African-American inmate in the Beaufort County Jail in Washington, North Carolina. Well, one night in August of 1974, Clarence Alligood, the 62-year-old sheriff, entered her cell. And allegedly, he threatened her with an ice pick and sexually assaulted her. Somehow, this small woman managed to wrest the ice pick away from him and proceeded to stab him to death. And then she escaped. North Carolina, of course, put her on trial for murder. And as she prepared for her trial, a broad coalition of supporters from the National Organization of Women all the way to the Black Panther Party rallied to her defense. Like the 1944 campaign to free and assist Recy Taylor from this injustice, the Joanne Little movement was led primarily by African American women, including, as it turns out, Rosa Parks, who organized the Detroit chapter of the Free Joanne Little campaign. And this fascinated me. So Rosa Parks had this long history of activism in this case. At her trial, prosecutors tried to paint Joanne Little as a typical black Jezebel, a stereotype rooted in slavery. They suggested that she actually wanted to have sex with the jailer, that she seduced him and then killed him as an elaborate plot to escape. They could never really explain how she convinced him to bring an ice pick into the cell, however. Little's attorney, on the other hand, fit her story into a much longer and more painful history. He read to the jury a passage from an African-American woman's 1902 essay, decrying their special vulnerability in a system in which white men could abuse them without punishment. And so by reading this old essay aloud and pointing to the past, Little's attorney bore witness to the decades of abuse that black women had suffered and to the decades of testimony that they offered. Well, after deliberating for over an hour, which isn't that long, the jury unanimously voted to acquit Joanne Little of murder. As the jury foreman read the verdict, Joanne Little broke into tears at the defense table, and her lawyers clustered around her. She raised her head and she said, "It feels good to be free." This cartoon in the Baltimore Afro-American, another black newspaper, hailed the verdict in Little's case as a major victory. Here, Joanne Little is portrayed as a champion boxer standing atop a bruised and battered Jim Crow. Hoisting Little's gloved fist into the air, her attorneys proclaim victory for their champ and a triumph over Dixie racism. And as you can see, with stars swirling around his head, looking tired and, I don't know, pretty out of shape, old Jim Crow, at least in this case, is down for the count. Now, it's been nearly 7 decades since Rosa Parks rode down to Abbeville, Alabama, to take Recy Taylor's testimony, and since she launched that case. The national and international campaign that she started helped draw attention to the ruthless heart of the racial caste system. I met Reese Taylor in January 2009, the same day that 1 million Americans gathered in Washington, D.C. to witness the inauguration of our country's first black president. And so we watched the inauguration in her brother's tidy kitchen in Abbeville, Alabama. And I asked her if she ever believed an African-American woman would become the first lady. Not in my lifetime, she said. Growing up in the Jim Crow South, Taylor knew that black women weren't even considered ladies. From slavery through the bulk of the 20th century, whites denied black women the most basic citizenship and human rights, especially the right to ownership and control of their own bodies. And so to see Michelle Obama take her place among a pantheon of distinguished American women was to bear witness to black women's centuries-long struggle for dignity and respect. Understanding that history, Michelle Obama told the Washington Post in 2008, is, quote, a process of uncovering the shame and digging out the pride that is part of that story, so that other folks, she said, feel comfortable about embracing the beauty and tangled nature of the history of this country. The brutal rape of Reese Taylor in 1944 and the sexual exploitation of thousands of other black women is a central part of our history that has been unacknowledged for too long. But black women's testimonies made that history impossible to ignore. While Reese Taylor never actually received justice in the nation's courts, in 2011, the Alabama state legislature passed a resolution apologizing for the state's, quote, morally abhorrent and repugnant failure to properly prosecute her case. And even though an apology is not even close to justice, it is an important step towards healing past wounds. Finally, even the governor of Alabama had to acknowledge Reese Taylor's humanity. I think that until we come to terms with this history, even its most shameful secrets and their legacies, we can neither really understand fully the past, nor can we really appreciate the present. Thank you.